Dr. David Waring joins me now. There are a lot of people in Newcastle who will be very happy to see the back of Mike Ashley. They will say that they are just going to hold their nose and cope with the new owners. What is your view on that?
Well, that's their choice, I guess, but let's be quite clear about why this is happening. The Saudi regime is not buying Newcastle United because they're great lovers of football, and it's certainly not because they've got a great concern for the people of Newcastle and their enjoyment of Newcastle United's fortunes. They're doing it for two main reasons. The first is what's called sportswashing, which is authoritarian regimes using sports to whitewash their public image around the world. We've seen that in lots of instances. We've seen it with the Chinese in the 2008 Olympics. We've seen it with the Russians and the World Cup a few years ago. We see it with the regime in Qatar, which owns Paris Saint-Germain. We see it with the UAE and Abu Dhabi's ownership of Manchester City, and now we're seeing it with Saudi Arabia and Newcastle United, the purchase of a football club to whitewash the image of an authoritarian regime. And the second reason why they bought the club, because there's going to be investment in the club, but also there'll be investment in the wider community as well. One of the ways in which these authoritarian regimes, particularly in the Gulf and in the Middle East, bind themselves to the big powers of the global north, especially the US, France and Britain, is by investing in these economies. And by doing that, they're able to prove their worth and their value to the British state. And in return for that, they'll expect support from the British state in local and geopolitical issues, like, for example, the war in Yemen, which the Saudis have been waging for 5-6 years now, with a lot of British assistance. So there's a geopolitical aspect and there's a PR aspect as well.
Saudi's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has made much of his efforts to reform the kingdom. It is improving, isn't it? But how much?
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest, it's not really. And this is something that my research has focused on a lot in the last couple of years. The language of reform is really part of the PR spiel. We have to be quite clear about this. So I'll give you one example. At the same time as the Saudis were telling us that they're reforming and using the example of the fact that they are now allowing women to drive cars, they locked up the women's rights activists who had campaigned for the right to drive. And those women were subject to, according to the leading human rights organisations, absolutely horrific treatment while jailed for campaigning for their basic rights. This idea that Saudi Arabia is reforming in the sense of its politics and sense of political freedoms and civil rights is just not true, I'm afraid. What they are doing is reforming their economy, and they're reforming their economy to give a more sustainable basis for the Saudi royal family to remain in power. And by the way, while we're talking about the human rights record of the Saudi regime, it's not just a question of how the Saudi regime treats its own subjects in terms of the jailing and alleged torture of women's rights activists and many other dissidents, peaceful dissidents. It's also about the Saudis' behaviour in Yemen, where, again, they're credibly accused by all the world's leading human rights organisations of indiscriminate killing of civilians, even of the potential use of starvation as a war tactic, which is a war crime. So this is a kind of regime that's now about to, it seems, purchase Newcastle United, a regime of a horrific human rights record and a record of behaviour in war in Yemen, which may go all the way up to guilt of potential war crimes. And it's this kind of behaviour that they're trying to whitewash with their purchase of Newcastle United. That's the purpose of the purchase.
It has been widely reported, as you're saying, all of these things, and Amnesty International themselves have lobbied the Premier League to try to stop this sale going through. Do you think that the Premier League will listen to this, or do you think that they will just allow it anyway?
It sounds like they won't, and from what I understand of the test that the Premier League applies to potential purchasers of football clubs, there's no real human rights test. And in fact, Amnesty have been lobbying the Premier League to adopt such a test, so you can't just have any old person buying a football club. I mean, look, we wouldn't accept the dictatorship in Syria buying Newcastle United. We all know what the dictatorship in Syria is guilty of. And Amnesty is saying that there needs to be a specific test to block these sorts of people from exploiting British sport and exploiting these clubs for their own ends. It looks like the Premier League are going to wave it through. And one of the reasons, apparently, from reading the reports this morning and last night, that the Premier League are going to wave it through is that they've been persuaded of the argument that's been made that the Public Investment Fund, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is going to be the major shareholder in Newcastle United going forward, they've been persuaded by the argument that the Public Investment Fund is a separate entity, an autonomous entity from the Saudi regime. I'm afraid this is just nonsense. It's laughable. And any expert on the Saudi regime, on the political economy of Saudi Arabia, will tell you that the Sovereign Wealth Fund is a tool of the regime. Its chairman is Mohammed bin Salman, the guy who's been accused by the Americans of being complicit in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, of ordering the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. He's the chairman of the Public Investment Fund, which apparently is going to be the major shareholder in Newcastle United. And that Sovereign Wealth Fund is really at the centre of his entire economic strategy over the last 5 or 6 years. The idea that it's separate from the regime is just a nonsense. But the Premier League apparently are going to argue that it is separate, and that's how they get this whole deal through and past their fit and proper person test.
OK, Dr. David Waring, we'll leave it there. Interesting to talk to you today. Thank you very much.